Much. Let's start with the first question over here. Yes, sir.
I believe you've just recently returned from Israel, and you were a consultant to the conservative government on economic policy. Could you relate the subject of tonight's discussion here to recent events in Israel and the policies which are being followed by that conservative government?
I would be very glad to do that, because Israel is a fine example exactly of the false road we have been following. The Israel has been following what has been largely a policy moving towards socialism. It's much farther along that road than we are. The ideology of the leaders of Israel from the earliest stages was fundamentally socialist. A labor organization called Histadrut is both the largest labor organization and the largest industrial organization in Israel. And the thing that is absolutely fascinating is the extent to which you have complete disillusionment among the people of Israel with this approach and this policy. The Begin government was elected. You call it a conservative government. I don't call it a conservative government. It isn't a conservative government. I'm not a conservative. A conservative is somebody who wants to keep things the way they are. Mr. Begin wants to change things. I want to change things. Mr. Begin is a liberal in the true sense of the word. I'm a liberal in the true sense of the word. The word is now used in a distorted way. The modern liberal is liberal only with other people's money. The word liberal means of and pertaining to freedom. And I believe in freedom, and a true liberal is somebody who believes in freedom. It isn't freedom for the government to take 40% of my income out of my pocket and spend it on things that we, through our political mechanism, have decided on, but nonetheless that I as an individual, you as an individual, have no control over. So I will not agree with your description of Mr. Begin or his government as conservative. They're not. They're a liberal government. And in fact, you see, the word liberal still retains its 19th century meaning in most of Europe. And if you take the parties which together make up the Begin government, a major party is a liberal party of Israel. Now, with respect to the problems, the problem has been that as a result of the socialist tendency in Israel, you now have an enormous fraction of national income in Israel being spent by the government. You have a wide range of government and quasi-government enterprises. Over half of the people in Israel, half the workers in Israel are employed by either direct or indirect governmental enterprises. You have subsidies and everywhere for industry, for labor, for what you name it. And the result has been that you have a very great degree of dissatisfaction on the part of the public at large in respect of the inefficiency which develops out of this kind of thing, in respect of the restrictions on people's lives and activities, and that's why there is no sentiment within Israel today for a continuation of a socialist government. The papers here made the election of Begin hinge primarily on international affairs. It didn't at all. It was dissatisfaction with the domestic policy and this socialist developed policy in particular that led, in my opinion, to a change of government. Now, I am not very optimistic that they will be able to resolve things or to change it. Their intentions are fine. But it's extremely difficult once you get very far along this road to go back, to turn around. And it's difficult because everybody, under those circumstances, gets a vested interest in continuing it, because everybody's being subsidized. I met, when I was in Israel, with the leaders of the Manufacturers Association, of the Agricultural Association, of the banking group, all of the various groups, the private groups, the groups that were the strongest supporters of Mr. Begin. And I opened my session with them by saying to them, you gentlemen are the greatest obstacles to a sensible economic policy for Israel. And they are. the manufacturers say, oh, of course, we're in favor of cutting out subsidies, but you should start with agriculture. And the agricultural people say, we're in favor of cutting out subsidies, but you start with industry. And the effect is you get stymied. But I wish them luck.
Will they go to a truly competitive?
That is the objective of many of the leaders of the new government, but I have my fingers crossed as to whether they will succeed in doing so. I hope so.
Well, thank you very much, and I could not have answered better on the question of liberal versus conservative. I agree absolutely with you.
Well, thank you. Very glad. Can we get some more questions here? Fine.
Dr. Friedman, first I'd like to thank you on behalf of all of us of having Bob Chittister talk you into doing this program.
Well, you thank Bob for talking me into it, don't thank me.
I've already thanked him. But I think you've put your finger on what really concerns me and many other people in the business community, and that is this whole area of increased government regulation, the four-letter words you were talking about. I don't share the optimism that you appear to have of being able to do something about this. And I wondered if you could perhaps disclose some of the reasons why you feel that this can be changed, and perhaps at the end of that comment on the whole, to me as an example of this regulation, what's currently going on in the Senate and in this whole area of gas deregulation, because it seems to me that it's all backwards. They've got the whole regulatory thing backwards, because I've always felt that if you somehow deregulated gas, the opportunity for producers to get more for their gas, they would go on out and search for more, and then we'd have more, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. Well, I quite agree on the final thing, but it's very interesting to, that's in a microcosm what's happening all over and what the problem is. Let me say first, I am by no means persuaded that we're going to turn the corner and go the other direction. It may be that we are on the downslide and we're not going to recover. If you look at most societies over the ages, if you look at most golden ages, and we've been through a golden age, they tend to be short, 100, 150 years at the most, and to be followed by a period of deterioration and decline. That's what happened to Rome, that's what happened to Greece. No reason why we shouldn't follow the same steps. So we may go in the same direction. But the reason I have some hope is mostly the major source of hope I have, frankly, is because government is so inefficient. That's the real hope. If government were spending the 40% of our income that it now spends efficiently, I'd give up hope. But thank God they waste most of it. People complain about waste. I don't complain about waste. Tell me, would you people in this room really like the IRS to be spending its money efficiently? Now, obviously, in general, we don't like waste, but one of the effects of this is that government doesn't have as much control as you might think it would. Because you and the other businessmen, you see, you have a war. You have a few 100,000 or 1 million bureaucrats, and you have 200 million people figuring ways to get around the bureaucrats. And generally, we mostly can outsmart them. Now, that wastes our substance and makes us poorer, but at least it preserves some element of our freedom. Now, that's a major source of hope, because it gives us maneuver, and it also means that the public learns that this isn't efficient. Now, the greatest source of danger, in my opinion, is in large part the business community. Don't make any mistake about it. To be pro-free enterprise is not to be pro-business. They are two very different things. And again, I'm not blaming people, but only trying to understand them. Go to the oil and gas regulation. Who are the lobbyists for keeping the controls on oil? If you read the newspapers, you'd think it was consumers. It's a bunch of nonsense. The major source of pressure for keeping oil controls on are one part of the oil industry. Because what you have in this case, consumers don't benefit from the control of the price of oil or gas. It's a bunch of nonsense. We pay the full cost of oil and gas. We're importing oil from abroad. Well, we have to pay for it, don't we? I assure you the sheiks of Arabia aren't paying for it. We're paying for it. And if we don't pay for it directly at the gas pump or at the fuel pump, we pay for it indirectly through taxes. So we're paying for it. Where's the pressure against deregulation? The fact is that right now we have a system under which you have, through price control, a heavy tax on domestically produced oil, which is used to pay a subsidy to those people who refine oil at home, and also to pay a subsidy for importing OPEC oil. To tell the full story gets too complicated. But that's the essence of it. It's one part of the oil industry versus another part of the oil industry. Similarly, there's been a great deal of discussion right now about steel. The steel industry isn't in favor of free enterprise. It wants tariffs, it wants import quotas. Again, I don't blame them. They're trying to protect their own interests. But the rest of us are fools if we let them get away with it. So that I'm not fully optimistic that we're going to solve this problem. But the reason I have some optimism is because what fundamentally determines what happens are the attitudes and philosophy of the people at large. Washington has been doing these things because the public has been telling him to. And the only hope is that the public changes its views and its attitudes and comes to recognize what's going on. And there's been a big change there. You no longer have the immediate belief on the part of the public at large that the way to solve the problem is to have government impose more controls. The public at large is fed up with that. And you have more and more examples. Don't you think it's been a very good example for the public at large to have Freddie Laker destroy the pricing system for transatlantic flights, which have been maintained by the Civil Aeronautics Board for these many years? Well, I think as those examples come along, the case for deregulating airlines is going to be very strong. And I think you may be able to get something done. That's why I have some optimism. Yes, ma'am.
Previous speakers have asked about energy and regulation. I'd like to combine the two. The industry that's historically regulated are the electric utilities, not only as to price, but how, when, and where, and so forth they can do business.
Sure.
Is it time to consider totally deregulating them? And if so, would you deregulate the nuclear industry for the safety aspects at the same time?
Well, now, you raised a series of very complicated problems which cannot really be answered in simple yes or no terms. Let me go to the very end. What we need is not regulation of safety aspects. We don't need regulation of safety aspects. We need responsibility. I am not in favor of our present system, under which the U.S. government provides insurance to nuclear power plants against catastrophes. Because if the U.S. government is going to assume the costs of such things, then it's going to have to impose the controls. What you ought to have is a system under which a nuclear power plant would be responsible financially for the consequences of any accidents that occur. Now, of course, as you and I know, the problems in this area have been enormously exaggerated. Nuclear power has been incredibly safe. It's been far safer than coal power or oil power or even water power in terms of actual experience over the past 20 years. But nonetheless, it is highly desirable to have arrangements, to have a set of rules of the game under which public utilities or companies that produce nuclear power are held responsible for any effects of their behavior. They ought to be responsible for compensating people, just as if you drive an automobile, you ought to be required to have insurance, which will enable you to be responsible if you hit somebody. It is an appropriate role of government to make sure that third parties are protected from things that they could have had nothing to do with. So in that respect, I think that you ought to eliminate many of the specific safety controls and regulations, but substitute requirements for responsibility on the part of power plants, whether nuclear or otherwise, for compensating people for any injuries that are imposed on them. Now we come to the utility industry in general. It is grossly overregulated. It would be highly desirable to reduce the amount of regulation. There is no problem in reducing the amount of regulation. A colleague of mine, George Stigler, made a study many years ago of the effect of regulation on the prices of utility, of electric utility and the others. And he did it by comparing different states, some of which did have regulation at one time, some did not. And lo and behold, regulation did not lower the price or affect the price that was charged to customers. You might ask, well, if you don't have regulation of utilities, what does limit them? Won't they go and raise their prices sky high? The answer is that there are always alternative sources of energy. There may not be, you may have only one electric line, but you have other ways of getting power. People can live in different areas. If you raise the price, they'll buy less, and so on. So that on the whole, I am very strongly in favor of a wide-scale reduction in the extent of regulation of utility pricing. Again, that's the kind of change that ought to be done gradually over a period of time and not necessarily overnight. There are two kinds of changes. Some kind ought to be done overnight. The regulation of the price of oil and natural gas ought to be eliminated tomorrow. No gradualism. That's a bunch of nonsense. All it will do is do harm. If you eliminated the regulation of the price of oil and gas tomorrow, it would not affect in the slightest the prices that anybody paid at the gasoline pump or for oil and energy. It would only redistribute funds within the oil industry. On the other hand, the regulation of the prices of electricity and so on ought to be eliminated gradually over a period of time, because people have adjusted their arrangements to that and they ought to have a chance to adapt. Yes, sir.
Dr. Friedman, is there an economic system now or historically that has allowed free enterprise alone to determine which direction the economy goes? And
well,
secondly, I have a three-part question.
Okay, fine.
Secondly, in economics you have resources, and how to best use these resources is a value judgment, but it seems to me you can have either free enterprise decide or government decide or some combination. And don't you think combination would be the best alternative? And thirdly, if I can remember it, isn't there some benefit to having the government steal our money, which is what they do effectively? They'll hold a gun to our head and say, pay us 40% of your income or go to jail. They take this money and they give it mostly to government employees. Well, the government employees spend it. The marginal propensity to consume is pretty high. So the people who were robbed have to do something creative to get the money back. And isn't this creative activity the real wealth of
Well, I take
the
it that they would have to be still more creative if 98% were being spent by the government. No, the third part of your thing is just pure fallacy from beginning to end. Because if those people who are now government employees were employed in creative activity and productive activity, they would also be spending their money. And we'd have a greater total around. All you're doing, let's suppose for a moment, take the extreme case, that 40% is being used just to have people sit around. The fact that they spend their money doesn't alter the situation. The only product there is what the 60% produce. And that 60% is divided among the 100%. If those 40% are also producing goods, then there are more goods to go around among everybody. You are just involved in a fallacy of looking at dollars, which is important sometimes, instead of looking at the real product, the goods and services that people produce and people consume. Spending isn't good. What's good is producing. What we want to have is more goods and services. And as I say, the obvious indication that that's clear is that if your logic were right, it would apply it for 50%, 60%, 70, 90, 98, 100%. And obviously, you would see that that would be a bunch of nonsense at that stage. It is desirable to have some money spent by government for those things, those services that we believe we can get more usefully and more effectively through government. If people are getting their money's worth, fine. That's why it's very desirable to have governmental expenditures take place at as local a level as possible. Because you, as a citizen of a small community, can judge whether you're getting your money's worth. You can decide that you want to spend it. But when it comes to the federal government, you tend to think that you're spending somebody else's money. And you are in a way. But he's spending yours. All right, now let me go back to the first two items. Is there any example of a society in which the fundamental determination of the direction of activity was determined by free enterprise, by free competition? Of course. most of history, most of societies today. The government does have 40% of our income that it spends, but it wastes half of it. So that as a matter of effective matter, 80% of our resources are being determined by free enterprise now. And if I go back to the whole period of the 19th century, to the whole period of the great growth of the U.S., to Britain in the 19th century, the period when Britain emerged as a leader of the nation, at the height of Britain's power as a leading nation in the world, at the time of Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1899, I think it was, or something, celebrating the 50th anniversary, the golden jubilee of her reign, when Britain Britain ruled the waves and had an empire on which the sun never set. Total government spending in Britain was 10% of the national income. So, of course, there have been many examples over time at which free enterprise has dominated and predominantly been the major source of determination. Today, it's true in Hong Kong and Taiwan, in many countries around the world. All right, now your second question is, does not the allocation of resources involve value judgments, and isn't it better to have that values judgment shared by government and the people? Who is government? What's government? Is that something other than you and me? Is that something than us operating through a different mechanism? Who can make value judgments? Only people. Resources don't make value judgments. Governments don't make value judgments. People make value judgments. And the question is, what is the most effective way in which we as people can jointly, cooperatively, express our values? Now, we express some of them individually in the family at home, separately, people, you and I alone. We express some of them by doing things for ourselves. We express some of them through voluntary groups, Boy Scouts, churches, charitable organizations. We express some of them through cooperation on a broader scale on a free market, through business enterprises that serve as intermediaries between people selling their productive services, producing products, and selling the product. We express some of our values through doing things through government. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, provided we keep in control and don't let the government become the master instead of the servant. And the real problem is, in my opinion, that as we move from the local community to the state, from the state to the federal government, it becomes increasingly difficult for us to control the mechanism we have established. And that mechanism tends to control us. That was the great wisdom of the founding fathers of this country, of the people who wrote the Constitution. That Constitution was designed to limit government's powers in order to preserve the freedom of the individuals. And what has happened in the past 50 years is that the fundamental character of the Constitution has really been changed. We have broadened enormously the conception of what is a governmental power and what is not, and have departed from that limited government until we have created a Frankenstein, an unlimited government that threatens to destroy us. Let's go to the next question.
Dr. Friedman, in last year's presidential campaign, a great deal of discussion was lent to the repeal of Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act. Could you give us some indication of your view on that, in particular to the restriction of freedoms of individual workers?
Yeah. Well, that's, again, the problem of right to work, which is what's involved, is a very difficult and complicated problem to discuss, but it's very relevant to the subject tonight, and I'm glad you raised it. In principle, I am not in favor of laws either requiring workers to join a union or preventing workers from having a closed shop. There's a very interesting thing, that on a level of principle, you can no more justify a right-to-work law than you can justify a yellow dog, the law against yellow dog contracts. Both of them are wrong. The Fair Employment Practices Acts, in my opinion, are wrong. because they interfere with freedom of contract. People should be free to contract as they wish. The right-to-work laws are in principle wrong because they are an interference with the freedom of employers to contract with a closed shop. And yet, on the other hand, as a practical matter, 14b prevents the imposition of a closed shop by governmental measures. What you've got is a situation here in which you have two wrong things, and you've got to choose among the lesser of the evils. The repeal of 14b would make it impossible for states to get out from under governmental regulations, federal government regulations, which in effect have the effect, even though this isn't legally their wording, they have the effect of mandating closed shops, even where both employers and workers might not want it. And 14b provides a loophole whereby the individual states get out from under that requirement. And as a result, what I'm really in favor of is not the repeal of 14b, but a much more far-reaching change of federal labor legislation, which instead of having the federal labor legislation be as one-sided pro-union as it is, made federal legislation much more neutral than it now is. And under those circumstances, I would not support right-to-work laws. Under the present circumstances, I'm in a dilemma. I don't like to support them because they seem to me wrong in principle, and yet they offset another evil, and on the whole, the right-to-work laws seem to me the lesser evil of the two. So I think you've raised a very difficult position. Let's take the last question, and then we'll let everybody go home.
Dr. Friedman, I'd like to hear your answer to a very simple question that's often very persuasive, and that's that the existence of big business requires the existence of big government.
Yeah. Well, the answer to that is that big government produces big business in part, rather than the other way around. There is nothing about the existence. First of all, what do we mean by big business? Businesses have gotten larger in absolute size. An individual business on the average employs much larger number of people than it did in an earlier stage. But in the main, business has not gotten bigger in terms of the share of the market occupied by a small number of enterprises. The great developments in the past 100 years have been improvements in communication and transportation which enable competition to operate over a much wider area. 100 years ago, you had much more local monopoly. The small enterprise was much bigger compared to the local market than the big enterprise can be compared to the broad market. Now, what's the problem of big business? There's no problem of big business, there's only a problem of monopoly. The problem is to try to avoid a situation in which you have only one potential employer or one potential seller of a product. What would be the most effective way of doing that? The most effective way of doing that is to have complete free trade, to have competition from all over the world. That would almost assure that no company could be in a monopoly position. Under those circumstances, what do you need big government for? Moreover, if you look at the way in which government has become big, it hasn't become big that way. Look at the federal government. What's made it big? What's the department in the federal government today that spends the most money? Health, education, and welfare. The big growth has not been in anything whatsoever having to do with big business. It's been in taking money from some people and giving it to others. It's been in the transfer payments, Social Security, welfare programs, food stamps, all of the rest of it, not in anything having to do with big business. So I think the argument that big business requires big government is a bunch of nonsense. It just is not in accordance with the facts. That if I subtracted from government those activities which have nothing to do with big business, I would be left with a very small government. Now, people ask a very different question that is related to what you say, and that's one I want to answer briefly, and then we'll have to terminate this. People say, well, what difference does it make whether it's General Motors you're dealing with or the U.S. government you're dealing with? Both are big enterprises, bureaucratic enterprises. Aren't you just as badly off? There's an absolutely fundamental difference. General Motors cannot get $1 from you unless you're willing to hand it over. It cannot send a policeman to take $1 out of your pocket. The U.S. government can. That's a fundamental difference. And as a result, I don't believe big business is the kind of threat that big government is. Thank you very much.